General Morrison stared at Maria with new eyes. One lucky shot could be explained by chance, but she was offering to repeat the impossible. Around them, the elite snipers stood in stunned silence, their professional pride wrestling with the evidence of what they had just witnessed. "Sergeant Gonzalez," the general said slowly, "are you suggesting you can hit that target again?" "Yes, sir. The dust pattern from the first impact showed me the exact wind conditions at the target. I can adjust for those conditions and make a second shot." Captain Blake stepped forward, his expression troubled. "General, I need to point out that Sergeant Gonzalez is not certified for this weapon system. Technically, she should not be handling specialized sniper equipment without proper authorization." Maria lowered her eyes respectfully. "Captain Blake is correct, sir. I apologize if I overstepped my authority. I was only trying to help solve the problem." But General Morrison raised a hand to silence the objections. 30 years of military experience had taught him to recognize genuine capability when he saw it. This quiet supply sergeant had just accomplished something that his best snipers could not do. Regulations were important, but results mattered more. "Continue with the demonstration, Sergeant." Maria returned to her shooting position. The second shot would actually be easier than the first. She now knew exactly how the environmental conditions affected bullet flight at this specific time and location. The mystery was solved. The rest was simply applying the correct calculations. She made small adjustments to her scope settings, compensating for the precise wind conditions revealed by the dust from her first impact. The target pit radio crackled with updates about wind speed and direction at the far end of the range. Maria listened, but trusted her own observations more than electronic instruments. The wind cycle was beginning again. She had approximately 60 seconds before the next comm period. This time, she would be ready to take advantage of it immediately. Her breathing settled into the same controlled rhythm. Her pulse slowed to match her practice technique. Lieutenant Hayes whispered to Sergeant Rodriguez, "How is this possible? She's just a supply clerk." Rodriguez shook his head in bewilderment. "I don't understand it either. Look at her form, though. That's not beginner's luck. She knows exactly what she's doing." The second shot broke even cleaner than the first. Maria's confidence was higher now that she understood the specific conditions. The rifle's recoil felt familiar and manageable. The massive muzzle blast no longer seemed intimidating. Target pit reports second hit. Center mass again. This time the silence lasted longer. 2 perfect shots at 4,000 meters was beyond coincidence. The assembled snipers began looking at Maria with grudging respect mixed with professional curiosity. Who was this woman? And where had she learned to shoot like this? "Where did you receive your marksmanship training, Sergeant?" General Morrison asked. Maria hesitated. Her background was not impressive by military standards. No special schools or elite programs. No famous instructors or prestigious certifications. Just a poor girl from Texas who had learned to hunt out of necessity and continued practicing out of passion. "My father taught me to hunt when I was young, sir. I've been practicing on my own time at a civilian range near my duty station." "What's your longest confirmed shot before today?" 3,800 meters, sir. At a quarry outside town. Captain Blake's eyebrows shot up. "You've been practicing at extreme range without supervision? That's extremely dangerous without proper spotters and safety protocols." Maria nodded. "Yes, sir. I always follow safety procedures and practice only when conditions are safe. I study ballistics and meteorology in my spare time to improve my understanding." General Morrison was beginning to understand. This was not luck or coincidence. This was the result of dedicated self-study and countless hours of practice. Maria had developed genuine expertise through personal initiative, without formal recognition or support from the military system. "Would you be interested in transferring to sniper training, Sergeant Gonzalez?" The question hung in the air like the echo of her rifle shots. Maria had never considered such a possibility. She had joined the quartermaster corps specifically to avoid combat roles. Her plan was to serve quietly, earn her college money, and return to civilian life without drawing attention to herself. But something had changed during the past hour. Standing behind that rifle, making shots that others could not make, she had felt a sense of purpose that her supply duties never provided. Maybe hiding her abilities was not the best way to serve her country. "I would need to think about it, sir. My current duties are important too." General Morrison smiled. Of course they are. But your current talents might be even more valuable in a different role. The training exercise was officially over, but the real learning was just beginning. The elite snipers gathered around Maria, asking questions about her techniques and observations. Their initial skepticism had transformed into professional interest. They wanted to understand how she had seen things they had missed. Sergeant Rodriguez approached her respectfully. That wind pattern you mentioned, about the 90-second cycles. How did you figure that out? I was watching the flags for about an hour before anyone started shooting. Patterns become obvious if you observe long enough. Lieutenant Hayes joined the conversation. What about the thermal effects? Our instruments didn't detect significant temperature variations. Not air temperature, sir. Ground temperature. That dark rock formation about halfway to the target creates an updraft when the sun hits it. You can see it in the heat shimmer if you know what to look for. The questions continued for 20 minutes. Maria answered each one patiently, sharing knowledge that she had assumed was common among professional snipers. She was surprised to learn that much of what seemed obvious to her was actually quite advanced. Captain Blake listened to the discussion with growing amazement. This supply sergeant had developed techniques that were not taught in any official training program. Her observations about microclimates and environmental patterns came from practical experience rather than classroom instruction. Sergeant Gonzalez, he said finally, I owe you an apology. And I think we all have something to learn from your methods. As the group began packing equipment for the return trip, General Morrison pulled Maria aside for a private conversation. His expression was serious, but not unfriendly. Sergeant, I'm going to be direct with you. The military needs people with your skills. Our current training programs are excellent, but they may be missing some elements that you've discovered through your independent study. Maria listened carefully. She had never imagined that her weekend hobby might become a career opportunity. I'm not asking for an immediate decision, the general continued. But I want you to consider how you might best serve your country. Sometimes the most valuable contributions come from unexpected places. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez graduated at the top of her sniper training class. She not only mastered the standard curriculum, but also contributed new techniques for reading environmental conditions at extreme range. Her methods were incorporated into the updated training manual. Today, she serves as both an active sniper and an instructor, teaching others to see the subtle signs that make impossible shots possible. Her students learn that precision shooting is not just about weapons and ballistics, but about patience, observation, and understanding the world around them. The humble supply sergeant who once preferred to remain invisible had found her true calling. In a profession where attention to detail can mean the difference between life and death, Maria's quiet competence and careful observation skills made her exactly the kind of soldier her country needed most. Maria approached the shooting position with steady steps. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but her hands remained perfectly still. Every eye on the training ground was focused on her now. The weight of expectation pressed down like a physical force, but she had learned to handle pressure during her childhood hunting trips when missing meant her family would eat beans instead of meat. Captain Blake reluctantly handed her his rifle, a precision instrument worth more than Maria earned in 6 months. The weapon was a Barrett M82A1, chambered in .50 caliber, equipped with the latest military scope technology. She accepted it with the same careful respect she showed all equipment under her care. The scope is zeroed for 1,000 meters, Blake explained, his voice professional despite his doubts. You'll need to compensate for the additional distance. Wind is variable between 8 and 12 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature is holding steady. Maria nodded and knelt behind the rifle. Her movements were economical and practiced, though none of the observers recognized the signs of genuine expertise. She did not adjust the scope immediately or check the wind flags like the previous shooters had done. Instead, she simply looked through the optics at the distant target. Sergeant Rodriguez whispered to Lieutenant Hayes, "She doesn't even know how to properly position herself. Look at her stance." But Maria's unconventional position was deliberately chosen. She had noticed that the concrete shooting platform had a slight vibration every time vehicles passed on the road 200 meters away. By positioning herself closer to the edge, she could minimize the effect of these micro-movements on her aim. Through the scope, The target appeared as a tiny speck against the desert background. At 4,000 meters, even the slightest error in calculation would result in a miss measured in yards rather than inches. The previous shooters had been close, but close was not good enough for combat situations where lives hung in the balance. Maria began her mental calculations. The rifle was zeroed for 1,000 meters, meaning she needed to compensate for an additional 3,000 meters of bullet drop. At this distance, a .50 caliber round would fall approximately 28 feet from its initial trajectory. Wind drift would add another complication, potentially pushing the bullet several feet off course. But these were just the basic factors that every trained sniper understood. Maria had noticed subtler influences that the others had missed or dismissed. The heat shimmer rising from a dark rock formation at 2,500 meters indicated an updraft that would slightly lift the bullet during the middle portion of its flight. The way dust swirled near the target suggested a localized wind eddy that would affect the final 100 meters differently than the prevailing breeze. She also recognized something that weather instruments could not measure. The quality of light was changing as afternoon progressed toward evening. This shift would create microscopic variations in how the scope's lenses focused, potentially affecting point of aim by fractions of an inch. At extreme range, such tiny errors could mean the difference between success and failure. Most importantly, Maria had been tracking the wind cycle throughout the entire exercise. While the other shooters focused on current conditions, she had observed the pattern repeating every 90 seconds. Strong gusts from the northwest, gradually diminishing to a brief period of relative calm, then building again. They were now 40 seconds into the cycle, which meant the calm phase would begin in approximately 50 seconds. "Taking your time, Sergeant?" General Morrison asked, though his tone was neutral rather than impatient. "Yes, sir." Waiting for the wind window. The snipers looked at each other with barely concealed amusement. Everyone had been waiting for wind windows. The conditions had been inconsistent all morning. What made this supply clerk think she could predict the weather better than trained meteorologists? Maria ignored the skeptical murmurs around her. She had learned patience during long hours waiting for game to appear in the quarry back home. Rushing a shot at extreme range was pointless. Either the conditions were right, or they were not. No amount of skill could overcome the laws of physics. She made her scope adjustments methodically. Elevation correction for bullet drop. Windage adjustment for the prevailing breeze. Then, smaller corrections for the thermal effects she had observed. Her calculations were based partly on standard ballistic tables, but mostly on experience gained through hundreds of practice sessions in similar conditions. 30 seconds until the wind window. Maria settled into her final shooting position. Her breathing became controlled and rhythmic. Her pulse slowed as muscle memory took over. This was the same feeling she had experienced as a child, waiting for the perfect moment to take a shot that would feed her family. The wind flags went still, not completely motionless, but as close to calm as the desert would allow. Maria's internal clock told her she had maybe 25 seconds before the next cycle began. She took a deep breath, released half of it, and began her final aim sequence. Through the scope, she could see the target clearly despite the enormous distance. Her crosshairs settled on the center mass of the silhouette. She made a final micro-adjustment for the light conditions, trusting instincts developed through years of practice that no amount of classroom instruction could provide. The rifle felt perfectly balanced in her hands. This was not the first time she had fired a Barrett .50 caliber. During her off-duty practice sessions, she had saved money to rent similar weapons from a civilian range that specialized in long-distance shooting. The recoil and ballistics were familiar friends rather than new challenges. 15 seconds of calm wind remaining. Maria's finger found the trigger. Her breathing stopped at the natural pause between exhale and inhale. The world narrowed to nothing but the crosshairs and the distant target. Every other sensation faded away. The shot broke clean and smooth. The massive rifle roared and bucked against her shoulder, but Maria had braced properly for the recoil. The muzzle blast kicked up dust around the shooting position. The sound echoed across the training ground like thunder. Everyone immediately turned toward the target 4,000 meters away, but it was impossible to see the impact with naked eyes. Spotting scopes swung toward the distant silhouette. Binoculars were raised. The radio operator called the target pit for confirmation. Spotting, spotting, came the voice over the radio. The seconds dragged by as the target crew examined the impact area. Maria remained in position behind the rifle, though she was fairly certain of the result. She had felt the shot break perfectly. The wind had held steady throughout the bullet's flight time. Her calculations had accounted for all the variables she could identify. Either she had succeeded, or some factor beyond her control had interfered. Target pit reports, contact. Center mass hit confirmed. The training ground erupted in stunned silence. Then, excited chatter. 13 elite snipers stood looking at the supply clerk who had just accomplished what none of them had managed. General Morrison's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement to something approaching respect. But Maria was not finished. She had observed something during her shot that the others would find interesting. The bullet impact had kicked up dust in a pattern that revealed the true wind conditions at the target. She now had perfect information for follow-up shots. "Sir," she said quietly, "would you like me to demonstrate consistency?" The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as General Morrison walked between the shooting positions. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cool desert air. 13 attempts. 13 failures. The target at 4,000 meters remained untouched, mocking every elite marksman who had tried to hit it. "This is impossible," muttered Sergeant Rodriguez, lowering his rifle in frustration. He had been the base's top sniper for 3 years running. His personal best was 3,200 meters, achieved under perfect conditions. Today's wind was tricky, shifting every few minutes, making calculations nearly impossible. Captain Blake wiped the scope of his rifle for the 5th time. His hands trembled slightly from the pressure. As the leader of the sniper training program, his reputation was on the line. The visiting generals had specifically requested a demonstration at extreme range. Instead, they were witnessing a parade of failures from his best shooters. "Sir, perhaps we should try a closer target," suggested Lieutenant Hayes, his voice barely above a whisper. The young officer had just missed by 3 feet, closer than anyone else had managed, but still not good enough for the watching officials. General Morrison's jaw tightened. He had promised the Joint Military Committee that American snipers could match any challenge. The new enemy positions in overseas conflicts required shots at unprecedented distances. Lives depended on this capability. His career depended on proving it was possible. The target was a standard military silhouette mounted on a platform exactly 4,000 meters away. Weather conditions were challenging but not impossible. Wind speed varied between 8 and 12 miles per hour. Temperature was steady at 72 degrees. Humidity sat at 35%. Professional snipers had made longer shots in worse conditions, but today seemed cursed. Maria Gonzalez stood at the back of the group, quietly observing. She wore the same desert camouflage as everyone else, but her uniform was slightly different. Instead of the sniper badge worn by the others, her chest displayed the Quartermaster Corps insignia. She was here officially to manage equipment and supplies for the training exercise. Nobody paid attention to the quiet woman who had arrived 3 hours early to check inventory. She had methodically counted ammunition, verified scope calibrations, and ensured each rifle was properly maintained. Her paperwork was always perfect, her equipment always ready. The snipers appreciated her efficiency, but never really saw her as anything more than support staff. Maria had learned long ago to blend into the background. Growing up in a small Texas border town, she had discovered that being invisible often meant being safe. Her father had been a ranch hand who taught her to hunt rabbits and coyotes to help feed the family. Her mother worked double shifts at the local diner. There was never money for fancy equipment or professional training. But Maria had a gift. From the time she could hold a rifle steady, she could see things others missed. The way grass bent in different layers showed wind patterns. The heat shimmer rising from distant rocks revealed thermal currents. Birds flying overhead cast tiny shadows that indicated light conditions. She read the environment like other people read books. At 18, she had enlisted in the army not for adventure or glory, but for steady pay and college money. Her recruiter had suggested infantry or military police. Maria chose Quartermaster Corps instead. She wanted a quiet job that would keep her out of combat while serving her country. She never mentioned her shooting ability during basic training. Now, 6 years later, she held the rank of sergeant and managed supply operations across 3 training facilities. Her efficiency reports were excellent. Her supervisors praised her attention to detail. Nobody knew that during her off-duty hours, she practiced with her personal rifle at the abandoned quarry outside town. The quarry had natural ranges extending beyond 2,000 meters. Maria had set up her own targets using military surplus equipment purchased with her savings. She practiced every weekend, working on techniques she had learned from library books and online forums. Her longest confirmed hit was 3,800 meters, achieved 2 months earlier during a particularly calm morning. "Any snipers here?" General Morrison suddenly called out, his voice carrying across the training ground. His question seemed rhetorical, given that 13 of the military's best marksmen surrounded him. But frustration made him desperate for any solution. The snipers exchanged glances. Some checked their equipment again. Others studied the wind flags hanging limp in the momentary calm. Captain Blake stepped forward, preparing to suggest they reschedule for better conditions. Maria felt something stirring inside her chest. She watched the flags, noticed how they moved in sequence from left to right. The wind was following a pattern, cycling every 90 seconds. She had been tracking it subconsciously for the past hour. Right now, they were entering the calm phase of the cycle. "Sir," she said quietly, taking one step forward. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of equipment being packed away. General Morrison turned, noticing her for the first time. His eyes took in her quartermaster insignia, her neat appearance, her respectful posture. "Yes, Sergeant. I might be able to help, sir." The training ground fell silent. 13 elite snipers stopped what they were doing to stare at the supply clerk who had just volunteered for an impossible shot. Some looked curious. Others appeared annoyed. Captain Blake seemed confused about whether to intervene. "You're not qualified for this exercise, Sergeant," Lieutenant Hayes said, not unkindly. "This requires specialized training and certification." Maria nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. I understand the risks and requirements. But I have relevant experience, and I noticed something about the wind pattern that might help." General Morrison studied her face. He saw something in her eyes that the others had missed. Confidence without arrogance. Knowledge without boasting. The same look he had seen in combat veterans who knew exactly what they could and could not do. "What's your name, Sergeant?" "Maria Gonzalez, sir. Quartermaster Corps." "And what makes you think you can succeed where these specialists have failed?" Maria glanced at the target, then at the wind flags, then back to the general. "The wind follows a pattern, sir. 90-second cycles with a 30-second calm period. We're about to enter the next calm phase. Also, the afternoon light creates a thermal layer that affects bullet trajectory. If we account for both factors, the shot becomes possible." The snipers exchanged skeptical looks. They had all considered wind patterns and thermal effects. These were basic elements of long-range shooting. Nothing this supply sergeant was saying seemed particularly insightful. But General Morrison had spent 30 years evaluating soldiers. Something about Maria's quiet certainty intrigued him. She was not showing off or trying to prove herself. She was simply stating facts as she saw them. "Very well, Sergeant Gonzalez. You may attempt the shot."